go ahead and get started here. Wait for Dan to close the doors. Once Dan closes the doors, that means nobody can come in and nobody can leave. You're stuck in here. It's the last chance. But we're going to be in Ecclesiastes Chapter 2 tonight, and so I'll just go ahead and start with a prayer. Father in heaven, we are thankful again to be gathered here this evening, and we're so thankful for the Bible that you've provided for us, that we can know you and know your thoughts and your mind, your plan for us, and we're thankful for the wisdom literature that we have and the writings of Solomon, that we can glean something from the life that he lived. And we know that there's a lot of things that pull at us throughout any given week, and I think that when we study this man Solomon and things that he learned from life and the life that he lived, I think that it can help us to slow down and appreciate you more and not take the things that really matter for granted. And so we pray that you help us to understand these words, that they'll help us, and we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we'll go ahead and just start off by reading here in a moment. But I just want to review real quick. I think that the main kind of thesis, if you will, of the book of Ecclesiastes, I mean, it seems like anytime somebody teaches a class, everybody comes up with a different thesis, and they'll say, this is the main verse of whatever book you're studying. But this does seem to be like a pretty big deal when you look at Ecclesiastes 1 verse 3, and he asks this question, what does a person gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? And I particularly think this is the theme, especially of chapters 1 and 2. But you see him kind of wrestling with this idea throughout the book. And when he asks the question, what does a person gain, or really what does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? He's asking that word gain, it's more than just, what somebody profits in this life from labor. I mean, Solomon was somebody that had experienced all kind of profit and gain in his life. But he's asking, really, when he asks that question, he's asking, what is like the lasting benefit from everything that we give ourselves over to in this life, of being tired, of being kind of beaten down, of everything that we go through on a daily basis, and how exhausted you are here sitting in your pew. What is the point? Where does it take us? What does it give us? What do we get out of it? And he's kind of wrestling with this, I think, throughout the book. And so he'll kind of bring up this same question periodically throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. And so that's just something to keep in mind, especially as we look at chapter 2. And I do want to remind us, vanity of vanities. Just that word, I don't want to make too big of a deal about it, but the word we looked at really means vapor, breath, fog, mist. And so I think that sometimes the author is trying to point out that something is vain, and then other times I think that's more of like a secondary point that he's making. And so the word really means like vapor, breath, fog. And so if you say that life is a mist or life is a vapor, you're not necessarily saying that life is meaningless. James says that, right, in his epistle that he writes. And his point there isn't to say that life is meaningless. His point there is to say that life is brief. It's mist. We're here and then we're gone. And we don't know when we're going to be gone. That comes sooner than we think. And it's to point out how kind of significant we are to predict what's going to happen tomorrow in comparison to God. And so that's one application that could be made. And then, like I said, other times it might be saying that, hey, this pursuit in life, it's empty. It's pointless. Other times this word is almost used to say that something is like confusing or puzzling to the author. Like when he talks about, he looks at the righteous, and the righteous get what the wicked deserve, and then the wicked get what the righteous deserve. And he says that this is Habal. This is, it translates it most of the time as vanity, but I don't think he's looking at that and saying that's meaningless. I think he's looking at that and saying that's confusing, that's puzzling, that doesn't make sense. And so it's kind of this word that he uses when he's talking about things that he wrestles with and trying to kind of make sense of them. And I think that it's flexible in what it means. But I like that the Bible in any translation you use is going to translate the same way every time because it's used over 30 times. And so you're supposed to see him using this word over and over and over again. But I think that the specific meaning of it kind of depends on the context. And so with that being said, and those things kind of in the back of our minds, let's just read verses 1 through 11. Does somebody mind reading? Let's just do verses 1 through 3, and then somebody read 4 through 11. 1 through 3, and then 4 through 11. Oh, I'm sorry, chapter 2. Yeah, sorry, I apologize for that. Yeah. And verses 4 through 11, or excuse me, to have you read through verse 3. Yeah. So yeah, verses 4 through 11. Thanks. All right, so I think that when you read these verses, he kind of does this in chapter 1 where he is giving his qualifications and how he's qualified to write a book like this, to write a book and describe, okay, what is the point of life? And so he kind of gives his credentials that he was king of all Israel. I think in chapter 2 here, he's kind of continuing to do that. He's giving us his credentials. Instead of just telling us what his conclusion is, he tells us all the work that he put into figuring out, okay, how is man to spend his life? What is the point of life? And so I think when you look at chapter 2, he's trying to find meaning in life, and he set out in pursuit to find meaning in life. And so I want to ask this as you kind of read through those things, and as we just read that, what are the things that he looked to in order to try and find meaning? What are the different areas and things that life has to offer that Solomon attempted to look at and find meaning? What didn't he? Yeah, true. Yeah, a little bit. Just kind of categorize it. I mean, to put it another way, what are areas that people in the modern age look at for meaning or try to find meaning? What are some common things? Okay, job, work, yeah, career. What else? Wealth, power, yeah. Family, okay. Pleasure, yeah. Possessions, yep. Yeah, you kind of have all over the spectrum, right? It's interesting. You have people that a lot of times they will try and find meaning in their work and doing something great vocationally, but now more and more you're seeing people that are saying, you know what, I want nothing to do with work. I'm going to sell my house. I'm going to buy a van. And I'm just going to go and visit places. And I'm just going to have fun. And they also try to find meaning in that way too. And so you look at Solomon, and I think there's kind of various categories in which he tried to find meaning in life. And so I think maybe the first one, in Ecclesiastes 2, verses 1 through 3, he said to myself, come now, I'll test you with pleasure to find out what's good, but that also proved to be Hebel. Laughter, I said, is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. And so the first thing that he kind of sets out, and keep in mind in chapter 1, he's already concluded, wisdom is not really the answer. That doesn't really fulfill me if I pursue wisdom. And so after that, he concludes, well, I'm just going to have fun. I'm just going to try and indulge in this life as much as I can and enjoy every moment of it. And so maybe he kind of goes through this period of life where he's what we'd often describe a free spirit, right? So his life is about laughter. His life is about wine and these vineyards he's planted. And who knows if that means, getting drunk, or some people, their life is about wine, but they like kind of the finer things in the year and the vintage. And maybe that's what he was into, is maybe more sophisticated in that way. But he had all these things as king to his disposal. And I kind of thought about this. It reminded me of a Twilight Zone episode. Anybody fans of Twilight Zone? Yeah. So who remembers this episode, A Nice Place to Visit? Anybody remember that episode? This one really struck me. I went through a phase where I was kind of into Twilight Zone, and this one always kind of stayed with me. Anybody remember this one? So it's about this guy, and he lived a lawless life. And by that, I don't just mean spiritually. I mean, he broke, the law. I think that when he died, he got gunned down when he was robbing a bank or something like that. And he wakes up, and of course, a guy like that, where does he expect to wake up once he dies? Right? He expects to wake up in hell. And to his surprise, he wakes up, and there's this guy with this, I think it's a white suit, standing next to him there. So the main character is the guy sitting down, and he's looking up at this guy who's kind of giving him a tour of where he is in the afterlife. And to this guy's surprise, as he's going on this tour, he has everything that he could ever want. If he's attracted to a woman, the woman doesn't reject him. He gets the woman. When he goes to a casino, he wins every roll of the dice. And there's people that are gathering around him, so he becomes popular and kind of famous because this guy just can't lose. Anything that he can imagine that he wants, he gets in the afterlife. And eventually, guess what happens? He gets tired of it. It's fun at first. The character loves it, and he's thinking, I'm in heaven. But the big reveal at the end of the episode is what? What do you guess it is? What's the big reveal? He's not in heaven, he's in hell. It's just interesting that, hell for him was everything that he wanted. And it just always stood with me and stuck with me that here, this guy, you could see it play out, that he was given everything he wanted. Eventually, he got tired of it. He became miserable. And I see kind of the same thing happening with Solomon. Did Solomon, you think, have any limits as far as what he was allowed to do when it came to having fun? Was he a guy that could do everything that he ever wanted? Yeah, you're talking women, you're talking parties, you're talking best kind of food, hanging out with the most popular person, the most entertaining individuals. He had everything that you could imagine as far as resources to just indulge. And so this passage in 1 Kings brings this out. It says, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. They were eating, drinking, and rejoicing. So, it starts with the king, right? The king was eating, drinking, and rejoicing, so the whole land was doing the same thing. Solomon ruled all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines and as far as the border of Egypt. They offered tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provisions for one day. So I take this to mean this is just for Solomon and his guys and kind of for his daily life. Solomon's provisions for one day were 180 bushels of fine flour, 360 bushels of meal, 10 fattened cattle, 20 range cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and pen-fed poultry. And so I read several commentaries that brought this out, that some estimate it would take 30 to 40,000 people to consume that much food each day. So was this guy living the good life? I mean, from a worldly perspective, he was. I imagine that when he's going through this period of his life, it's like every day is a party. And when it's the king throwing the party and the king has this much at his disposal, what do you imagine those parties were like, right? I mean, they were living it up, and yet what did he find? Well, he'll go on to tell us what he finds. And so he parties it up for a while, but then he says, I undertook great projects. So he's looking now vocationally at work and accomplishments. And it says that I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. Made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. So, does this kind of remind us of Solomon as he's described in 1 Kings, by the way? What are the accomplishments that we know Solomon accomplished in his life as king? What are the types of things that he built and that he did? He built the temple, right? What else? Built a palace for himself, built a palace for his wife. It tells us that he has all these gardens. So when you just look at, he was into agriculture, he was into building, he was into innovation. When you talk about these reservoirs that were specifically made to water these trees, there's some people that think that was probably pretty innovative for that time. And so this guy is just, putting himself into his work, into his accomplishments, and maybe he's thinking, if I build something grand, if I do something grand, if I achieve something grand, that'll give me meaning, that'll give me fulfillment, and I will be remembered for it. And yet we're going to find that that wasn't the case either. And then you go on, and it's possessions. He says, I acquired male and female servants and had slaves who were born in my house. I also owned livestock, large herds and flocks, more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I gathered male and female singers for myself and many concubines, the delights of men. So anybody remember how much gold it says Solomon had, gold and silver that he had when he was reigning? It tells us in Kings and Chronicles. Well, it doesn't really specifically tell us. But it says that the gold and silver were like stones, is what it says. So it's like gold and silver. He amassed so much of it that it became like nothing for him. And so again, this is a guy that has accumulated anything that you can think of. And so you look at those two things, putting yourself into your work or making your life about obtaining things. And I think that we see even in the world that people who put themselves into the work, are they ever satisfied? I mean, think about the richest people in the world, right? Who do you think of when we think of the richest people in the world? Who comes to mind? Bill Gates. All right, so is he just doing nothing nowadays? I see him on the news, and somehow he's like a medical expert nowadays. They're always interviewing him, and he's researching, and he's buying up farmland, and he wants us to eat grasshoppers for the rest of our lives, but that's another issue. But what about Elon Musk? Is that a guy, he's made billions of dollars. Is he satisfied? Is he done? Now, what's his big goal that he wants to achieve? Where's he want to get to? He wants to get to Mars, actually. I mean, moon is like, maybe we'll get to the moon. Let's skip the moon, let's go to Mars is his goal. Jeff Bezos, I don't know what that guy's up to. I think he wants to take over the world or something. Amazon seems to own everything. But these guys have achieved so much, and from our perspective, you think, $1 billion, isn't that enough? Well, maybe $2 billion, $3 billion? I mean, at what point are your accomplishments enough? And yet, what we find time and time again is the most successful people always want more of what? What do they always want more of? They want more success, right? Make an even bigger name for themselves. And it's the same thing when it comes to possessions and entertainment. How many of you had one thing that you really wanted as a kid that just sticks out in memory? Christmas is coming up, right? How many of you as a kid remember one particular toy or item that you wanted more than anything else, maybe up even to this day in your life? Anybody have something like that, a memory that they look back on? And, I think all of us kind of have something like that, a toy that we look back on, our favorite Christmas. And when you get that toy, you open it up, how excited are we as kids? Pretty excited, right? And then what happens 2 years later? What happens to that toy? 5 minutes later it's broken, or 2 years later, it's buried somewhere in the back of the closet and you want something else. And it starts as kids, And it carries on into adulthood. There's all sorts of things that we say, if I had that, then I would be happy, right? And that starts as kids. When you look at the iPhones that come out every 2 years, you have people that literally will camp out in tents the night before the new iPhone comes out so they can be the first one that has it. And then 2 years later, what are they doing? They're camping out in a tent for the new iPhone that's coming out, and got that one that they camped out for 2 years ago in their pocket. This is what we're always doing. It's never enough, but we always convince ourselves that if I had just a little bit more, right? If my job was just a little bit better, if I was making just a little bit more money, if I was driving the car or truck that I wish, or my dream car, my dream truck, then I would be happy. If my house was a little bit bigger, if I could do the renovations that I wanted to do in my house, then I would be happy. And the list goes on and on and on. And every time, we might get something, what ends up happening? Are we satisfied? We say, okay, now I'm happy for the rest of my life. No. We end up finding something else that we want, that if we had it, then we would be happy, right? And that's anything. That's people even. When we're looking for relationships and maybe we wish we were married or wish we had children, and we say, once I'm married, then I'll be happy. And yet we find, no, the problems don't stop when you get married. Not because we're married, of course, but Natalie's not here, so I can't get myself into trouble tonight. But I think that you see my point. And so he kind of was looking in different avenues of life, trying to find fulfillment, and this is the conclusion. He says, all that my eyes desired, I didn't deny them. I did not refuse myself any pleasure, for I took pleasure in all my struggles. So in other words, anything that he saw and he wanted, he indulged in it. It was available to him. There wasn't one thing that he looked at and said, I want that, and he couldn't have it. And so what you have in the book of Ecclesiastes is this grand experiment. What happens if you could have anything that you ever wanted? That's Solomon. And what does he teach us? He says that, I put myself into my work. I took pleasure in my work or my struggles. And he says, this was my reward for all my struggles. In other words, his reward was what? Yeah, I kind of enjoyed it, but that was it. I think that we've all done something or worked on something, and we get some satisfaction out of it, maybe a house project or maybe some sort of vocational accomplishment. And it's satisfying for a moment, right? But it's not lasting. It doesn't give us that lasting benefit that I think Solomon is really trying to get after. And so he says, when I considered all that I had accomplished and what I had labored to achieve, I found everything to be hebel. And maybe here he does mean meaningless. And a pursuit of the wind. You ever try to pursue wind or to bottle up wind? If that's your goal in life, how long are you going to be working at that? Till you die, right? You can't control the wind. You can't grab onto wind and hang on to it. Some people think that this actually means to feed on the wind, right? So how much wind do you have to breathe in, or how much wind do you have to drink and eat before you are filled by wind? It's never going to happen. That's not what wind was designed to do, right? And so when he looked at all his endeavors, he tried to just enjoy life. He tried to put himself into work, into accomplishments. He said, okay, well, now I'll amass as much gold and silver as I can and buy as much as I can. And what did he find as he endeavored in each of those things to find meaning? Did he find meaning? No. He said it's meaningless. It ultimately didn't satisfy. And so every time I kind of make this point, because obviously this kind of point comes up often when you preach, that this life, what it has to offer, pales in comparison to what waits for us, right? So every time I kind of make this point, I can't help but bring up this interview of Tom Brady. Now, maybe none of you care about Tom Brady. Maybe some of you know who he is. But Tom Brady, best football player in the history of the NFL. He has 7 Super Bowls. That's a record. So he's won more championships than any other NFL player in the history of the NFL, right? I mean, I think that's correct, right? And so this was an interview after he had won, I think it was 3 in a row, I think they won, or they won 3 championships within a close period of time. So this is, he has 4 more before he gets up to 7 at this point. So this is all the way back in 2005. And so he sat down with 60 Minutes and was interviewed by, I think it was Steve Croft. And Tom Brady says this, right? So this is a guy, again, he's got money, he's got championships, he's got fame, married to a supermodel, literally. And so he says, there's times when I'm not the person that I want to be. This is right after he wins the third one. He says, why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me? I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, hey man, this is what it is. I reached my goal, my dream, my life. Me, I think it's got to be more than this. I mean, this can't be what it's all cracked up to be. I mean, I've done it. I'm 27, and what else is there for me? And so the interviewer asked, what's the answer? And he says, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. So there's a guy, he had partied, no doubt, after he won 3 Super Bowls, had every accomplishment you can think of. And did that give him fulfillment? Did that give his life much more meaning? No, if anything, it made him despair even more. He was saying, I accomplished a lot of people's wildest dreams, and what I'm finding is that it's not what it's cracked up to be. It's not as fulfilling as, what it's advertised to be. And he still was kind of looking for that meaning. And so I see Tom Brady kind of coming to the same conclusion that somebody like Solomon did on a smaller scale. And so that was kind of Solomon's pursuit there and trying to find meaning. And let's kind of continue on in verse 12 unless somebody else has something to add. Anything else stick out to you in that section? So it's interesting because in chapter 1, he ends it by saying, okay, I looked at wisdom and I found that wasn't the answer. And so then in chapter 2, he said, I'm going to try and find meaning in life and work and indulging. And then in chapter 2 and verse 13, he kind of pivots back to wisdom. He says, okay, let's go back and let's consider wisdom. So he's kind of going back and forth. And does somebody want to read verses 12 through, let's do 12 through 17? 12 through 17.
Then I turned myself and considered wisdom and madness and folly. For what can a man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as life excels darkness.
Sorry, all the way to 17. Yeah, no, you're good.
The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same thing happens to them all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever. Since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. Therefore I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun is distressing to me. For all is vanity and grasping for it.
All right, so he pivots back to wisdom. And it's kind of interesting. He's making a comparison between wisdom and folly. And what does he say when he's comparing those two things? Wisdom is better. He does say that, but in my Bible, the heading says the relative value of wisdom. And I think that's a good summarization of what he's talking about here. He's saying wisdom is better than folly, but it's also relative to say that. And why is it relative? What does my heading in my Bible mean when it says the relative value of wisdom? Relative to what?
Your overall scheme of things, they both die. Pretty much the same.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, how do we square this? Because you read Proverbs, and I kind of ended making this point last week, and how big of a deal is wisdom within Proverbs? Big deal, right? And he goes on and on about the value of wisdom. So, but here in the grand scheme of things, he says, it's vanity, right? So why does he reach that conclusion? What's missing as he reaches that conclusion? What's the difference between the wisdom as described in Proverbs and maybe the wisdom he's talking about here? What? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's you say time and maybe perspective. So there's a phrase throughout Ecclesiastes that talks about under the sun, under the sun. it kind of begins to make you think, okay, what about above the sun, right? So I think that's part of it. So good point. What else do you think leads Solomon to say in the final analysis, this is vanity? What's that? Yeah, it's going to be beneficial to you. He says that wisdom is more valuable than foolishness, like light is more valuable than dark. So that makes it pretty. In what way is light more valuable than dark? That makes it pretty clear, doesn't it? Why is light better than dark?
You can see, you don't stumble over something.
Right. Without light, you really couldn't do anything. You couldn't find any enjoyment, right? You couldn't even find anybody to marry, right? Because how are you gonna meet them? How are you gonna find them, right? You can't work in the dark, and so he says wisdom is better than folly in the sense that light is better than darkness. That there is some relative value to it, but in the end, what happens to the wise person? What happens to the foolish person? Andy already brought it out. What happens to both? They both die. And so when you're looking at it just from that perspective, it seems like wisdom has very little, if any, value. And so I think that when he talks about wisdom, he's talking about a wisdom that is all-encompassing. When somebody puts their whole life into just being wise, I think that's the wisdom that Solomon is talking about. That when you make the central purpose of your life being wise, you're going to find that in the final analysis, it's pointless because the same thing happens to you that happens to the fool. So what's the point of it? It's a wisdom that he's considering that I think kind of leaves God out of the equation, or at least takes center stage before God. And so as you look at this, he looks at wisdom, he looks at pleasure and trying to enjoy life and find meaning in it. And this is kind of his findings as well. Let's keep reading here, verses 18 through 23. Somebody want to read verses 18 through 23? All right, so did you see in verse 22, he's asking that same question that I said is kind of the central question of Ecclesiastes. He says, what does a person get with all his work and all his efforts that he labors under the sun? So he's asking, what is the lasting benefit of all of this? So he's put himself into work, into wisdom. And when it comes to his work, he said, I began to hate my work. Well, that's different than what he said back in verse 10, where he was saying, well, I enjoyed my work and this was my reward for it. When he looked at kind of the ultimate result of it, he says, I hate my work, because what is it that he found? What happens to all those achievements and all those things that he has possessed? Yeah, somebody else is going to come and get it. And there's some people that say, well, maybe that is what our life should be about. Maybe our life at this point should be about setting up the generation after us. We talk about generational wealth, right? And setting up our family, maybe not just our kids, but our grandkids, and kind of setting them up for life. And that's going to be my meaning. That's where I'm going to get fulfillment. When Solomon thought about this, what was his problem? Why didn't this give him any satisfaction, thinking about leaving it to somebody else? What does he say in verse 19? What? Could be a fool, right? I mean, actually I have a statistic behind me. It says 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation. That's a real statistic. That's crazy. And is stunning 90% by the third, according to the Williams Group Wealth Consultancy. So 70% of people, by the time that money is handed from the first generation, and by the time you get to the end of the second generation, they've blown it all. And so you can amass all this wealth and think, finally, my lineage is going to be set, they're going to have money, but then they blow it because they're fools. He says, how do I know that I'm really leaving it to somebody that's going to do something wise with it and that it's not going to just end up in a fool's hands and he's going to blow it all? When you look at 1 Kings 14 and verses 25 through 26, I want somebody to read that for me. 1 Kings 14, verses 25 through 26. Somebody mind reading that?
Happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's house, and took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made.
So who is Rehoboam? So how many generations before everything Solomon had amassed was basically taken away from the Egyptian king? One generation. Went to his son. His son made it to the 5th, I think it was the 5th year of his reign when this happens. And that's on a grand scale, but this kind of thing happens all the time. And it seems he recognized when he writes this, like, okay, I've amassed all this, but how do I know that I'm even leaving it to somebody that's going to do something with it? He says, it will take over all my work that I labored at skillfully under the sun. This too is Hebel. So he said, I began to give myself over to despair concerning all my work that I had labored at under the sun. When you read this, it sounds like a lot of like CEOs that we sometimes read about, doesn't it? That you have somebody that's just looked for fulfillment in all the wrong things, and they begin to really contemplate, okay, what is the meaning? And they begin to search it out, and in the final analysis, what is it that Solomon began to feel in verse 20? What does it say he began to feel? He gave himself to what? To despair. There's this author, I think his name is Philip Schaeffer, I think is his name. But he had this approach to evangelism where basically when he was dealing with atheists, he would get them to see how pointless and meaningless life is without God. And he was very good at it. And so what do you think was the result a lot of times when he was talking with these atheists? How would it make them feel eventually? Yeah, make them depressed, right? Which is kind of the point. And his wife actually asked him once, if this approach you took caused somebody to attempt suicide, would you stop? Because he would really have that big of an effect on people. And he said actually he had one person who attempted it, and when it didn't work, when that didn't happen, when they failed at suicide, they ended up becoming a Christian. And I think that's kind of interesting. But he kind of took this approach that I think Solomon is kind of taking and writing the book of Ecclesiastes, that life without God, you can chase whatever you want. We can put ourselves into our jobs and think that if I achieve such and such a thing, then I'll be happy, and then I can die with a smile on my face. But what Solomon found is that everywhere he looked, it ultimately resulted in his heart being in despair. And he looked at his work, and it didn't give him satisfaction. And he looked at what was under the sun, and it didn't give him satisfaction. And so how do we have joy in this life? That's really the question, and I think that he answers that, and this is where I say Ecclesiastes isn't really the depressing book that it's always cracked up to be. I think that he wants us to see the problem of life without God, but there's a very hopeful note that this chapter ends on. He says, there is nothing better for a person than to eat, drink, and enjoy his work. I've seen that even this is from God's hand. There's different ways to translate verse 24. And actually in the Hebrew, when you look at it, there's no word that makes it a comparative statement. So in other words, in order to say that there's nothing better than blank, they have to insert a Hebrew word into it. And the reason they do that is because Solomon makes a similar statement throughout the book, and they say, well, maybe we just lost that word. If you translate it literally, this is what some people think Solomon is trying to get across, and I think this is the point really either way. That it's not within man's power. That there's nothing good in man that if he eats and drinks and and does all those things, there's nothing good in man that will allow him to enjoy or to have joy in and of himself. Where does joy ultimately come from? Where does happiness ultimately come from? Is joy a good thing? Remember James, in his epistle, he tells us where all good things come from. Where do they come from? Come from God. And so when you think about it, you can't have joy unless God gives you the ability to have joy. That's the only way. And if you're seeking to have joy without him, if you're looking for happiness without him, if you're looking to give yourself meaning and to give yourself joy and to give yourself fulfillment, you're going to find yourself, it's like, a hamster wheel, right? You're just going to be on this endless cycle and you're never going to be satisfied. He says that I have seen that even this is from God's hand, because who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from him? For the person who is pleasing in his sight, he gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy, but to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and accumulating in order to give to the one who is pleasing in God's sight. Solomon's conclusion, when you get to the end of this section, is that you can't enjoy this life without God. So let me ask this, do you think that's true? And if it is true, how is it true? Because a lot of times people say Christians have no joy. We're constantly saying no to things. We're constantly making ourselves miserable so that one day when we die and get to heaven, then we can have joy. And yet what I think Solomon is saying is that the only way you're going to have joy in this life is if you're pleasing and are walking with God. And so do you think that's true? And if so, how is it true? Yeah. Okay. Who's done, sir? Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. It's not just Musk that wants to get to Mars, it's Bezos too. They both want to get to Mars. Yeah. No, they do. Yeah.
You're the guy here at the top, and you're making all this money, but yet your people are working for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So who's it really about? It's about you. It's selfishness.
Yeah.
You're not thinking about God. Well, you think about others, that it's all about you.
And once they get to Mars, if they ever do, they're going to get there and they're going to say, what's that planet over there? I'd like to get to that one. It's just going to go on and on and on. But I go ahead, Becky. Yeah. Yeah, so if you just live a life that's selfish, we see how much of a mess that causes. And when you just give your life over to indulging, you have to deal with guilt and you got to struggle with that, and I know I'm doing what I shouldn't be doing. But when you think about people even throughout the Bible, when they did it without God, when they tried to enjoy life without God, were they able to do it? There's some examples that I can think of where that didn't work out. What about David? Was he seeking to enjoy life when he did what he did with Bathsheba? How did that work out? Ended up with him losing a child and him weeping, before God that wouldn't happen. What are some other examples that are like that? When somebody had everything and they weren't able to enjoy it? What about Nebuchadnezzar? Remember him? He's walking and he's observing everything that he's built. He's kind of like Solomon of, the non-Jewish world, right? And his vertical gardens, and he's talking to himself, he's proud of himself, and then what's the next thing that happens to Nebuchadnezzar? He becomes like this wild beast, and he goes insane. There's all sorts of examples like that we see in the Bible, but what we begin to realize is that even the ability to enjoy something, that comes from God. Because all it takes is one small thing happening, and I could have everything in the world, but this one thing goes wrong in my life. It doesn't matter what I have. I'm not going to be able to enjoy it. When you look at your relationship with God, I think the reason we are able to enjoy life is because we're able to be content. We're able to receive these things kind of as a gift from God, not taking anything for granted. And so I think this is really important for us to see that, yeah, there's kind of this depressing note sometimes in the book of Ecclesiastes, but he tells us that somebody who is pleasing to God, who's walking with God, they can enjoy life. And I don't want us to think that Christians aren't meant to enjoy life. I think about in the New Testament, what is compared to being invited into the kingdom? It's like being invited to what? What's it compared to? A wedding feast, a great banquet. What about the parable of the prodigal son? He goes out and he parties, doesn't he? And then where does that get him? Living in the pig slop, right? But when he comes home, what happens? Anybody remember what happens? There's a party, right? And so God wants us to enjoy life, but that's only going to happen when we put God first. If we make joy an ends, a means in and of itself, if we try and find that in work, we're just going to find ourselves in this kind of endless pursuit, literally pursuing the wind, right? It's not going to happen. Solomon says that the way it happens is by receiving or going about life as if it's a gift from God, and receiving life as a gift from God. And so that's kind of the first section there of the book of Ecclesiastes. Anybody have anything that they would like to add as we kind of looked at some of those things? Anything stand out to you? All right, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up there. Thank you. Kind of warm in here, isn't it? See a lot of people going like this.